Hey everyone, my name is Chloe, and the article that I'm going to be discussing this week is based off of dyslexia. The article is Rapid Improvement of Reading Performance in Children with Dyslexia by Altering the Reading Strategy, a Novel Approach to Diagnoses and Therapy of Reading Deficiencies by Reinhard Werth. This article's main focus is on reading disturbances. In the U.S., there's about 5 to 10% of children with reading disturbances, and in German-speaking fourth graders, there's about 15%. More specifically, we get more into the topic of dyslexia. Dyslexia is an impaired reading ability that's much lower than other cognitive abilities. It is caused by impairment of abilities and may have many different causes and could also be the result of other impairments that are prerequisites for fluent reading. So the diagnosis of dyslexia must exclude poor reading due to certain sensory impairments. Some of these sensory impairments may include reduced visual acuity, visual field defect, elevated luminance difference threshold, deafness, and impaired speech perception. More frequent in children with dyslexia may include things like phonological impairment, visual crowding, and poor saccadic control. So now we'll get into the methodology used in this article. The participants included 100 German children who suffered from dyslexia. This included 71 boys and 29 girls that ranged from ages of 8 to 13 years old. They also included two groups of these participants. There was a training group of 50 students, 36 boys and 14 girls, and then there was also another control group that had the other 50, and this was actually an age-matched control group that consisted of 35 boys and 15 girls. And this article did conduct two different types of experiments. In experiment one, both groups participated, so the training group and the control group. They looked at pseudo words, and in this experiment, they reduced the number of letters, prolonged the directed and between presentation and pronunciation times, and also reduced the amplitude of the saccades. And then in experiment 2, only the training group participated. In this group, in this experiment, this group learned the compository reading strategy, and then the reading performance was then tested before and after learning that new reading strategy. Alright, so now to get more in depth into experiment number 1, there were 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 letter pseudo-words that were presented at eye level on the monitor to the children. And then the researchers examined the length of time that the gaze was directed to the word or word segments to recognize it. There was a 40-centimeter distance between the eyes and the monitor, so the eyes of the children to the monitor where the pseudo-word was put on the screen. These pseudo-words were in black lettered, and then also they were presented between 250 to 500 milliseconds. There were 20 pseudo-words of the same length at the same time interval in each experiment, and then they were repeated every 5 and 10 second intervals. Also on the monitor, there was a green fixation mark in the center of the monitor, which was then replaced by the pseudo-word. The children had to read aloud that pseudo-word, and if wrong, the child would then have to spell and write the word. Also, there was a new investigation that they would do if it was wrong. The role of the time intervals between the beginning of the presentation and the pronunciation. The experiment used a different list of 20 different pseudo-words with the same number of consonants and vowels that were also in the same location in the word. A tone was presented after the presentation of the pseudo-word to prolong the time interval between the presentation and the pronunciation. So in the first trial, the time interval was prolonged for 1 second, and then the time interval was prolonged by 1 second more until at least 95% of the pseudo-words were read correctly. And then after the pseudo-words were presented to the children had to read aloud the pseudo-word And then, like I said, if wrong, they would spell and write the word, but after that, no feedback was given to the children. All right, so experiment number two. Experiment number two studied whether a child's ability to read a text improves if attempting to recognize words or word segments simultaneously that consisted of no more letters than being able to. They also studied whether a child's ability to read a text improves if the amplitude of the reading saccades does not exceed the number of letters that is being able to be recognized simultaneously. And they also studied whether a child's ability to read a text improves if fixating on the word segments for the time needed, and this would be considered adequate fixation intervals. And then lastly, they studied whether a child's ability to recognize a text improves if the time between the presentation and pronunciation of the word is sufficient. This is known as adequate speech onset interval. To obtain an adequate reading strategy, the children were forced to read only words or word segments that they were able to recognize simultaneously from experiment 1. They were also forced to fixate and pronounce the word segments for the right amount of time. And then they were also forced to execute eye movements that matched the length of the word or word segments, which could be recognized simultaneously. Okay, so now we will look at the results of this study. In experiment number 1, they found that adjustments can be made where dyslexia children can read 95% of pseudo-words correctly. These adjustments can include location of eye direction, number of letters read simultaneously, fixation time on a word, an instant of starting pronunciation. In most of the children, the rate of mistakes did not go below 5%. And correct fixation, extended fixation time, reduced number of letters, and delayed pronunciation led to that 95% of words being read correctly. Over here to the right is a graph that was shown on the study results of experiment number 1. And these were the reading mistakes are on the left, and then down at the bottom is the fixation time, or fixation point of the pseudo word. So if you look right here, in the very first spot, you see 1, 2, 3. The fixation point was at number 2, so that is the second letter. So the rate of misread letters depended on the location of the letter in the word, and these actually increased from the first letter to the letter to the right of the fixation point. So you can see they always get higher right after the fixation point. So if we think back to the graph on the previous slide, we talked about the reading mistakes. The reading mistakes are errors in this case. This is what they considered an error or mistake, where letters read incorrectly, letters that were omitted, letter location was swapped, or the letter was read that was actually not in the word. And then we look at the control group, so there was no significant difference between the percentage of an incorrect read word when reading half of the ZRT first and then the other half after, and this is that reading strategy. The Hedges G value was 0.109, which means that there was no effect, and the time needed to read each half did not significantly differ. Children who were not able to recognize more than 3 letters simultaneously made significantly more errors in the ZRT, and then children who were able to recognize 5 or 6 letters simultaneously made fewer reading errors in the ZRT. Right, and so here is another table just kind of showing some of the results of the study. This table shows the number of letters, fixation times, and mean speech onset times of all 100 dyslexic children when they were altered until at least 95% of the pseudo words were read correctly. So looking into the results of experiment number 2, we see that children in therapy groups had to fixate the words on the monitor at the correct location and for a sufficient amount of time to exert the correct eye movements and not to pronounce the words too early. And when they actually read print instead of on a monitor, the reading mistakes dropped by 58.78%. Appropriate fixation was a term that was discussed in this study. Appropriate fixation is focusing on words correctly. It is necessary to have appropriate fixation to be able to read correctly. Approximately, you want to fixate in the middle of the words. That would be appropriate fixation of a word when reading. If the focus is at the beginning or end, fewer letters are in the highest visual acuity, and some are in the lowest visual acuity. Visual acuity basically just means vision clarity. So, if we're looking at the left side, we might not be able to see the right side of the word as well, and vice versa. So you want to look right in the middle of that word to be able to read it correctly. Poor reading can be caused by an incorrect fixation, which may improve with the appropriate fixation. And fixation was controlled in the experiment by forcing the children to focus in the middle. Another term that is discussed in this article is simultaneous recognition. This is fluent reading is being able to read letters simultaneously, and we must be able to recognize the letters simultaneously that appear in highest level of visual acuity in a short time interval. Reading errors will occur when someone tries to recognize more letters than able to recognize simultaneously, and then two short time fixation limits the ability to recognize letters simultaneously. In experiment number 1, the ability to read simultaneously did differ among the children, and then prolongation of fixation times increased the ability to recognize the letters simultaneously. Poor reading of letters simultaneously can also be caused by an independent disturbance. Another topic of discussion in this study was saccades in reading therapy. Saccadic eye movements must be adjusted to the ability to read letters simultaneously. So when we look at the brain actually selects the target of the saccade and programs the eye movement to move towards the target, and then it performs the correct saccadic eye movement. In experiment number 2, the children learned to perform eye movements when reading. Like I touched on before, there are some types of reading improvements that help. One of those is actually not slow reading. Slow reading was found in the study to not be sufficient in reducing reading errors and mistakes. But some of these reading improvements do include adequate fixation time, recognizing a limited number of letters, adequate onset speech time, and then saccades that executed with amplitudes that do not exceed the ability to recognize these letters simultaneously. Therapies among the children were not all the same, and they were dependent on the number of letters that the children could process simultaneously. One last term that was discussed in this article was the syllable segmentation in reading therapy. Reading training in experiment 2 was highly effective. Like I said before, there was no effect in the control group, but the segment size and fixation time must be adapted to each individual's reading ability. So it cannot be improved by training in syllable reading, and then mental representation of syllables did not play a part in training, but the segment of words should be subdivided and cannot contain more letters than can be recognized simultaneously. Lastly, I just want to touch on the neurological impairments and basis of dyslexia. These include the magnocellular deficit, a disruption of the left hemisphere posterior brain system, dysfunction of the left occipitotemporal area, abnormalities in the left temporoparietal cortex, middle frontal gyrus, left inferior frontal gyrus, superior occipital gyrus, parieto-occipital regions, and the supramarginal gyrus. And lastly, the left frontoparietal, temporoparietal, and ventral occipitotemporal fiber connections, and the arcuate fasciculus, superior longitudinal fasciculus, inferior fronto-occipital fasciculus, and the optic radiation in the corpus callosum. So that is all I have for the article by Werth about dyslexia and reading strategies that can help to improve reading. And that is all I have for you today. Thank you so much for your time. Yeah, bye.